Good evening. My name is Alberto Keosian, and I am the Learning and Engagement Coordinator here at ICALA. We're so grateful you are here and online for tonight's program titled Building a City, Labor, Memory, and Those Who Shape It, presented in conjunction with the exhibition Jackie Castillo, Through the Descent, Like the Return. This program lands at a time when our government and its agencies challenge Los Angeles with displays of aggression and excessive deployments of armed forces against our community. This program is extremely relevant to our current unrest and poignant for exploring Jackie's powerful work. We'll begin with the focused discussion around the artist and the exhibition, then we shall open the floor for questions and discussion. For Jackie Castillo's first institutional solo show, we have a moving reflection on labor, memory, and our built environment. Through sculpture, photography, and installation, Jackie draws out the often invisible histories embedded in the materials of our city, from terracotta shingles and rebar to sidewalks and rooftops. The installation was made in collaboration with her father, Roberto Castillo, benefiting from his expertise in engineering for the installation, and hence, the program also includes themes of familial and cultural knowledge passed through generations within immigrant and working class communities. These stories are often overlooked in official records and histories. Tonight, we are joined by the artist herself and two brilliant thinkers and makers whose work asks us to reconsider how our cities are built, not just architecturally, but socially, culturally, and emotionally. We are honored to have this conversation among Jackie Castillo, the artist of Through the Descent, Like the Return, whose work centers labor, memory, and personal histories held in the physical infrastructures around us. James Rojas, urban planner, artist, and founder of Place It, a participatory design practice that uses storytelling and object making to center historically excluded voices in imagining urban futures. And finally, Nicolas Orozco-Valdivia, writer, curator, and PhD student in art history, whose scholarship explores how art and spatial politics intersect, particularly through Latinx perspectives. Together, they'll explore how both visible and invisible forms of labor shape our experiences of place and how memory, personal, cultural, and collective, might be used as a lens for imagining more just and inclusive cities. Before we begin, we request that everyone observe some basic program protocols. This session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you wish to hide yourself from view, please turn off your video feed. We ask that you remain muted while our panelists are in conversation. Please submit any questions, comments, or resource links into the chat. If you would like to ask your question, please use the raise hand feature and we will call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. We will be monitoring questions in the chat and try to get to as many as we can by the end of the program. Finally, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Hi, thank you for being here. Thank you, Alberto, for that introduction. I'm going to start by sharing my slides here. And I'm going to hide my face. Okay, so thank you. I want to start by saying that the work we're about to talk about is made to honor and make space for the working class immigrants and the undocumented and people of color. So I'm going to give a little introduction to my practice. I started making film photographs in Orange County in 2009. And since I've been documenting the Southern California built environment, the space between the sidewalk and our homes by means of walking. But in 15 years, I've come to understand that these photographs of working class front yards are a way for me to express the ongoing struggles of class, and that they often depict these visions of our alienated selves and our alienated labor. They are moments that represent often through the interplay of light and space, what it can feel like or what it can feel like and looks like when social relations and labor become objectified or reified. That is, they appear as fixed things rather than human-made processes. Framed through the lens, these are also frozen moments that reveal how the built environment can act as a kind of mirror for our collective unconscious anxieties. the need for order, the fear of exposure, the desire for stability are revealed in ways the eyes can't see. Photography frames these gestures, these fortified homes, barred windows, carefully trimmed lawns, alongside everyday manifestations of the chaos of our inner lives. But these are also sites of potential recognition, for the viewer to see the cracks in the illusion of normalcy, and for working class memory and resistance to be held in view. This image presents a kind of strange lattice-like structure that seemingly reemerges from the deepest shadows. However, this photograph was made in broad daylight. While the front faces of the lattice is clearly lit and detailed, the structure also appears to be lit from the rear, casting a strong enough shadow, equally dark, onto the sidewalk. Here, this becomes a monument to, I think, entrapment in it sort of appears in an urban, suburban front yard in Anaheim, but also a Colosseum-like structure, right? The camera can make the invisible visible. It can draw attention to what is ignored, erased, or undervalued, without depicting the laborer here, who is often undocumented, an immigrant and a person of color. A photograph can encapsulate the psychogeography of working class conditions. For those that labor to construct the very ground we walk on, the buildings that hold our lives, the emotional and psychological charge of sight are revealed through atmosphere and composition. The teetering tension of labor is evidenced, as is the precarity of the future for the working class. There's also instability and messiness of the construction of all the systems that sustain our lives that often goes unseen and not acknowledged. In this photograph, the yard is in process and engulfed by sort of this black sea of plastic. The plants and the pavers appear half-born in a liminal state, mirroring how laborers are often denied narrative closure. They shape beautiful places, but they rarely get to inhabit them. This visual metaphor can convey sort of a psychic splitting, to be present but unseen, productive but unrecognized, shaping beauty while being denied it. The people's bodies you can see here are partially obstructed, right, by the frame of the photograph. They reflect a kind of fragmentation of the self that repetitive physical work can cause. At one point in my practice, I asked, what if photographs are not just seen, but absorbed or felt in our bodies? The topiary is an object in the landscape that embodies the endless cycle of labor it takes to produce the illusion of control. Here in photographic space, the top of the topiary appears meek and small, while an explosive cypress is framed directly behind it. The word topiary, in fact, derives from the Latin word for an ornamental landscape gardener, topiarius, the creator of topia or places. While people labor to maintain it, the role of our society's placemakers and placekeepers directly impact our everyday lives. So how can photographic practice attend to the body's way of knowing when you have felt a photograph more than you saw it? In this work, the place cannot be, there's two projectors, right, that are projecting this image that we just saw. On the other side is the same image with everything edited out except for the very top of the topiary. And in the middle, I placed a cone-like structure that obstructed. Well, it both reflects and refracts light, bringing out into space this three-dimensional object made from two-dimensional photographs. A more recent project, Someone's Paradise, made for Cypress College's art gallery, is a photograph of this surreal yet idyllic scene of a topiary, sort of atomic family mounted on automatic sliding doors. As the viewer approaches, the image splits apart. never allowing the viewer to access the illusion of paradise up close before it breaks apart. In this photographic installation titled "There Is No Outside," the question of alienation and colonial history through spatial fragmentation is experienced as well as built into the architecture of the everyday. 3 photographs made in Anaheim, California on the same day hang in relation to each other. In these working class yards, there is often visible tension between public appearance and private experience. The central piece here is wall mounted, and it depicts this island-like mass of flora and fauna, and there's actually a house behind all of that, right? And we can sort of understand that with the bottom part of the photograph. We see the sidewalk, asphalt street, and also a little hidden in this documentation, there are those garden dividers paving the edge of the yard with the sidewalk. And of course, in the middle is sort of what made me make this photograph, was this flag, this American flag staked in the middle of this island-like plot of land. Something we don't see in the frame, right, are the houses to the left and the right of this site, which are it's a very long track of homes in Anaheim. A key detail of the work is this image of colonial sails painted on the side of a tract home just a few streets away. In this photograph, the sails seemingly come up over the horizon line of the Southern California cinder block wall. The Spanish Royal shingles lining the roof, also an important detail. So now we come to Through the Descent, Like the Return, now currently on view at ICALA. This work was made in deep collaboration with my own family. First, I want to acknowledge that I worked with my sister Elizabeth to create a digital rendering that my father and I used every step of the way to complete the sculptures and imagine them in space. For almost a year, I worked with my father, Roberto, who helped me engineer how to make seemingly impossible possible and how to create order out of chaos. The title, Through the Descent Like the Return, invokes a cyclical fall, representing both literal and symbolic forms of descent and displacement. It also offers a loop through to say what falls does not vanish. I think so much about the colonial conquest of California by Spain and later the US marked a descent into systems of extraction, exploitation, and racial hierarchy that persist today. State-sanctioned efforts to expel the very communities who built it through deportation and repatriation campaigns is nothing new, right? People have always been treated as expendable labor once economic or political ties shift. Still, many of those expelled by force or precarity return. Some cross the border again, others rerouted generations later. This region's demographic and cultural presence will never be entirely removed, as much as xenophobic rhetoric and discrimination stoke nationalism, targeting the undocumented, immigrants, refugees, and communities of color. So even if denied spatial belonging, this is a realm where transformation is always possible. Now I want to share this these 4 sets of images. These are stills of where the sculptures for this installation came from. This work is, situated at the borders between the photographic and cinematic and real space. And, these, for those who are new to the work, these falling shingles, right, come from recording laborers stacking these roof tiles in on a structure in Mid-Wilshire and then tossing them into a dumpster. And that's sort of the moment that made me stop and look and observe for a long time before I made the video. But as this shingle sort of fell through the air, I noticed in these sort of fraction of seconds, this transformation happening. And I tried to imagine what it would look like for all of them to sort of fall in line. What was happening? And then this question came up of what exactly am I trying to freeze here? Is it a halting of a destruction or a halting of the damages that happen to a body in labor? As I conceptualized the work, of course, I returned to the history of photography and its influence in depicting space through time. I revisited the influence of chronophotography of Murray and Mulbridge and others had on artists working with found materials. And of course, this influenced greatly so many artists, including Marcel Duchamp in this seminal painting, Nude Descending a Staircase. And in my conversations around the work, I was reminded of an early critique of the work, remarking the painting resembled an explosion in a shingle factory. And I'll end here with this newest work, which really becomes an extension of this project at ICALA. This work is titled Casting, and it's a sculpture that sets up the tension between structure and facade, labor and ornament through photographic sculpture. A 35 millimeter black and white photograph marked by direct midday light reveals stilt-like and jagged shadows of roof tiles onto a blazing white stucco wall. The project projects both Spanish Revival architecture and Art Deco, two architectural styles that helped construct Southern California's regional identity. Promoted by the booming real estate and film industries of early 20th century Southern California, Spanish Revival lent a sense of a colonial history, a romanticized one, while Art Deco signaled modernity and progress. But together, they represented an architectural ideal that where past meets the future. You sort of carefully look at the sculpture, you'll notice varying geometric relationships and ways of stacking. There's three notable ones, bricklaying patterns. There's stretcher bond, herringbone, and stack bond. Here's where the inlays of masonry and embodied labor become revealed. Beneath the aesthetic forms is an architecture that hides, yet reveals the sharply embedded colonial violence within our built environment, while casting aspersions about the vision of the future of this region. Thank you. Stop share.
Okay, I'm gonna keep my comments brief. Can you see the? Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna talk more about a little bit of the art history, and focus on one aspect of Jackie's sculpture. I'm trying to think about how it moves between photography and sculpture. Jackie, if this makes absolutely no sense to you, we could talk about it afterwards. I saw the show for the first time last Saturday, and I was struck by the difference between the experience in person and the experience of seeing it in images. The photos feel spacious and still. There's a certain amount of calm to them. Everything is in its right place. But when you walk into the gallery, you're surrounded. It's such a small space, actually. The tiles are above you. They're kind of beneath you. They lift you up. They bring you down. It's a tight fit. They pin you in. They're falling on you. You try to escape. You try to dodge. You move. You delay the inevitable crash, which of course never comes, because as soon as you stop moving, they stop moving. Sometime in the early 1890s, Edward Muybridge hired someone to paint a donkey onto a glass circle. They're painted from photographs that he took. We don't know the name of this person. It's considered one of the earliest forms of moving images. Muybridge called it a lot of different things, but mostly settled on zoopraxisco, if you want to look it up. It's made of glass. You can imagine holding it in your hands as sort of a large vinyl record, right? You could see the whole thing. You could turn it around and see the back. And more than the back, you can even look at the edge, right? You can feel how fragile it is and see how the light plays on the surface. If you dropped it, it wouldn't break into neat little tempered glass cubes. It would break really ugly, sharp shards. You would get all cut up. It would make a mess. Nasty little slicing slivers of glass. They would get under your fingernails. Everything breaks eventually. You don't even have to qualify with eventually. Everything is constantly breaking. That's how it works. But one of photography's most heartbreaking promises is that it can stop this process, that it can freeze time, stop the breaking. In a photograph, nothing will change, nothing will age, nothing falls apart. Photography always arrives in the nick of time, but it can't change a thing. The tile is already falling. The city is being bulldozed. The trigger has been pulled. Earlier, I had described Jackie's sculpture as cinematic, as always in motion. But of course it's not. The tiles are suspended, frozen in time and space. Caught up in the camera shutter, the tiles are suspended midair. They will never hit the ground. Photography always arrives in the nick of time. We can think of this in two ways. One is as a document of a changing city, so photosculpturally. This is a long and illustrious tradition that dates back to the invention of photography. Some of the earliest photographs are of Paris in the mid-19th century, some of the poorest parts of the city, those dense, convoluted, medieval neighborhoods that would soon be razed by Haussmann to make way for new, beautiful, straight and clean, modern boulevards. The freewayization of Paris, the East LA of its time. This is a sort of labor and a building of the city, which is often the breaking of, the tearing down of the city, and photography acts as its memory. But there's another way, which is not so clearly pictured, in which Jackie has already talked about in some ways, and that's of the laboring body, which breaks down as it breaks down, which is consumed by the building of the city at an alarming rate, on top of the already high toll, the wear and tear of building and maintaining your own life in a very hostile country, right? The body breaks down at a shocking rate, even without the fear of being detained and deported and disappeared, which of course is not new to our moment. Visually, I think you can see this sort of in the stacking of the tiles of the sculpture, in their balance, like so many spinning plates kept up in the air. Photography always arrives in the nick of time, but it can't change a thing. From this desire to suspend, from this desire to suspend, this is actually, that's wrong, we're not going off that. From this desire to the suspend, we might understand why the tiles are held up with rebar, why it's actually so stiff and so strong, so easy to see. It's not a trick of the eye. This is a very constructed, it's almost not sculptural, right? It's construction. It's a labored over. It's not magic, it's work. It's a trying to hold dear of something, hold someone close, using whatever materials and whatever excuses you have at hand. You'll use tiles, bricks, rebar. I saw some people use Lime scooters over the weekend. And that's what maybe art is here, right? It's an excuse and a necessity of holding deer to catch someone while they're falling. And then sure, there was a bunch of other stuff which we might get to. There's snakes and ladders, like you go up, you go down. It's supposed to be fair, moral tale. There's Heidegger, who thought that art started with a temple and was a Nazi, and so houses and and then this is another Muybridge that I wanted to end with, just of the dancing that keeps going. And okay, and here we're gonna skip past my comfort slides. Here it's Falling, Sarah Charlesworth stills, Dwayne Hansen, who's one of my favorite photographers, and new topographics. Great.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
James Rojas, I'm gonna share my screen.
Okay, just
Yeah. There you go.
perfect.
Yes, so I was really struck by Jackie's work, because I've been looking at Latino built environments in LA for the past 35 years, both informal and formal. It's kind of where this collision happens with labor, where people come to the US, they work on these new developments, drywall, skyscrapers downtown, and then they go home to their communities and they build. The culture that we just build, and how even everybody participates in this building process to create these kind of ephemeral temporal places, like this woman selling brooms in East LA, Boyle Heights. It took 30 years ago. So it's always constant change of events and activities, but it really been shaping LA, again, both formally and informally. And me as city planner, we're kind of caught in the middle of this dialogue, code or not code. It really, but these practices will shape our cities. So just to give a little background, I just want to talk about how just the memory of place and labor, are connected. You can't separate out the history of why it happens, and as opposed to when the British colonized the New World, it was about transactional exploitation of land and people. Thomas Jefferson built Monticello was built on slave labor growing tobacco. On the other side of the story, us as Latinos, we kind of inherit this indigenous blood that we come with, and then we're confronted with the Spanish conquest and law of the Indies. The law of the Indies was very intentional book of urban planning, basically, that said cities should be located here and designed this way. So, for example, that's why Los Angeles is located 20 miles from the sea and not in Santa Monica, not Long Beach, but in the middle of nowhere. Basically, the Spanish wanted to control a tight grip on economic development, and that's why we have Alvera Street, La Placita downtown, because the Spanish looked to the plaza as the center of community life, where the British, whatever the economic story was, that played out the urban form. There was never any code. It just kind of happened. Whatever the economy created, that's what created. So we have this kind of world where, so. So we have this kind of world that we create here that's kind of shaped by all these forces, and you see it playing out in LA. When Latino front yards, Latino houses, it just gets played out in the way people use their spaces. So I look at houses in Boyle Heights, East LA, and how they're shaped. Latinos kind of interpret that plaza and put it in the front yard of suburban Orange County or suburban Alhambra. So it's a really interesting, so labor becomes this way of, this day labor, that kind of conduit between this informal and formal world. And it shapes the way we live, you know, and so how they build is basically, you know, basically looking at these kind of landscapes. And so yeah, so that's kind of the work I look at, and just looking at the way, you know, these people, how we travel, like, you know, which is a traditional house in Mexico, Latin America, with the zero lot line, the patio, then we have this American suburban house, and we have this East LA vernacular, which we're in today. It's had a fence and a porch, and it just really kind of reshapes this landscape in informal but a formal way. Because we all live in it, we all see it. And so this is the house I looked at, you know, 25 years ago, or I don't know, 1991, where, you know, the wooden house, we stuck with it, they added the porch, they added all this fence, and it's been evolving ever since in different ways, but it's all very much DIY. Did they get it built? Did they get a permit for this? Who knows? You know, but it just happens because we're working in this space where it's formal, and you know, they're working in developments, formal developments, skyscrapers and beautiful developments, and they bring this knowledge back, and it's just do it themselves. That's a very kind of expressive culture, and this is what it looks like from behind. You see this whole architecture of aspiration, you know, memory. Now, I want to build. You know, you might people, these folks might have lived in this in a shack in Tijuana, but yet they want to have this kind of feel of hacienda, feel of a mission, so they build it different ways. Yeah, so but this whole use of space really shifts the way we think about suburbia and the suburbs. You know, for example, you know, in a suburb anywhere in the U.S., people, we have these front lawns that nobody walks on. It's kind of a psychological barrier. So people always, you know, just kind of everybody knows their position. On the contrary, most of these front yards here in East LA, they have fences around it. So the fence becomes this kind of point of interaction. So it really kind of shifts the way people look at cities. So we use it. So this is when I did my research, you know, it was all done from the front gates. That's a really normal place where people talk and interact, and really kind of creates this kind of different dynamic for the community, where people end up being hyper social and knowing each other's, you know, situations because they're always outside in space, where as opposed to the classic American suburb where you don't walk in the grass, people kind of stay inside. So this is just a picture I took about some shrine in the middle of South LA, somebody built at a bus stop. Who knows why they built it? Who knows why it's there? Who knows who paid for it? But this kind of labor just kind of spills out in the streets of the neighborhoods. And again, you know, what is design? Is design, you know, most architects and planners, we learn about design to solve a problem. Or if you're an artist or somebody else, look at designing to have an aesthetic. But then there's just the design of relationships. You know, why is this stuff here? Who put it there? Is there, you know, I read it just to, but it's no, but it's about a relationship. A relationship between these objects and how this front yard relates to the community in a different way. And so this last slide kind of shows this shrine in El Margarita zone in East LA, where they took a parking space and made it into a shrine, where it just has no connection to land use at all. It's the parking lot, and that's how most people view it, but they never think about it as being this kind of sacred space. So it's how this kind of informal world is shaping our community, and how we look at labor as memory and place, and how it really kind of helps us understand the space that we live in. Thank you. Sharing.
Thank you, James.
Sweet. So I think Alberto, you'll like take questions as they come up, but also we'll talk, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I had a question for you, Jackie. How do you, I guess it was to maybe to talk more about your process of making the work and how it maybe crosses through different kinds of making and practices. Like you had James talking about the sort of DIY nature of East LA front yards and how they kind of accumulate over time. And I think from like an art historical perspective, that's like sometimes similar or different than how an artist or an MFA sort of program or practice or museum would encourage making. And maybe that doesn't make sense, but you could talk about how you started with this work and what the process was like.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as an artist who I'm so invested in really reacting and creating spatial relationships, even though, you know, I'm a photographer by trade and, you know, been doing it for so long, but really being hypersensitive to how my body operates in space has been something that has been part of the process of making for a long time. And when this, you know, this proposal for this project came along, I really spent time thinking about this site where it was and near downtown, but also the architecture of this room in particular being a square, which is kind of a very constricting way of sort of like being and navigating. You know, when I was looking at these stills of these falling shingles, you know, it was really actually a turning moment in my practice where for the first time I thought of making a work that was simply using objects and not photographs, right? And how to activate every sort of aspect and part of this room from the floor to the, you know, 16-foot high ceilings, which is why we have the 4, you know, and maybe I'll just go back to this, this image here. You know, the site, sorry, we're gonna share the screen. Right, the 4 sculptures sort of cutting in through space, and they're also, you know, positioned in like very, you know, the decision to make them sort of turn slightly in space came later after working with that 3D model that my sister made, where I cut them all, the top view out, and I sort of cut these different little groupings and like really thought about how, you know, how this is more about, you know, a turning of time of the neighborhood of the body, how to activate that in the space, and then, you know, using these found objects, which came through and a different sort of interesting process of someone in Downey, the city of Downey, wanting to, you know, repair their roof, going to the city and finding out that they weren't able to actually put these 93-year-old tiles back on the roof because they were too heavy and it goes against code. So, you know, also, you know, having this conversation about the renewal of materials or reuse of materials instead of them ending back in the dump.
So do you think like you're like moving into this, you said like this is like a work that doesn't have a photograph on it.
Right.
How does it carry through? Does it feel new? Is it over? Photography's done, right? Like,
well,
what
yeah. Is it over?
Or is it all? Or can you ever get away from it? Is it always gonna be?
I mean, I still think we're not even. We're still in it. We're still in like a cinematic sort of space here, where, you know, it's, gosh, like we really are looking at it. To me, I mean, they still function as like stills of a moment in time, sort of present moment. So it's, you know, it's quite difficult for me to sort of get away from thinking about the still and how it functions in the space. And then, you know, in the actual space, we still have the photograph, right? That helps to sort of situate site and place here. We recognize on the left side, the Spanish Revival frontage, right? The window that is lit by this red ominous lighting. That's how it was, right? It wasn't edited. the topiaries appear there again on either side of the edge of the frame. And then, you know, that shot in mid-Walsh are pretty close to where the video of the shingles came from. And then across from that is this photograph of these castillos, right? These rebar structures that my grandfather built in Guadalajara on his roof. So, you know, the work is still sort of photographically situated between two different countries, two different spaces, places, also times, right?
Yeah, I think,
Jackie,
I'll go.
sorry, so I was just going to add, just because you did bring up the materials in the installation, Gustavo Rincon in the chat is curious about where specifically those materials came from. If you can maybe expand on where the materials for the installation are coming from specifically.
So the shingles, right, are from the city of Downey. They're almost 100 years old. These materials of the photographs, they're made of cement board. And you know, the photographs are printed on this sort of screen-like material, so you actually can really see through the photograph. Or, you know, there's sort of this moment where we don't quite sure where the photograph lies in the works. And you absolutely see the raw edges of the cement board being the material of the photograph.
Yeah, there's this transition between photo and material, or image and object, right? It is really fraught. And I think one of the interesting things in your work is that you feel a lot of care for the sculpture, but also like an awareness of how fragile and dangerous that jump is. I think that one of the ways you can think about like what Trump and what they're trying to do, right, is, and why it's so cruel, is that they treat people as images, right? It's the jump in the opposite direction. Like they have absolutely no care for the pain and the hurt that they cause, right? Because they're after these images that they can write. Like they're using Los Angeles in a very like image theater way, right? They just want photos. I mean, they want all sorts of things, right? That's just not the only thing they want. But they're creating these images they need, and they'll use it. They'll do it however they want to, right? And that's a jump from real world to image, and it's some of the sort of like scariness and the danger that I think is in the work somehow that you're holding on to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think your work really kind of captured the spirit of the Latino neighborhood in East LA. You know, but I think it's all about how you feel about space. It's all about these memories of objects. It's all about what you bring into the space. But it's all about how Latino in general just bring all this stuff with them when you occupy a space. That front yard you just built with the fountain and the light and the fence and the benches, are about a memory of place, but it's also a very physical feeling. You design it to your scale. You design it to how your body needs that kind of nourishment and stuff around it. Where I think as more formalized way of planning, you know, or designing architecture, we build skyscrapers, we build freeways, and the human body is never really part of that question. It's how does my car navigate this freeway? You know, it's not about my body in that space. So it's very alienating. So you juxtapose this, and if your work, you know, Landscape of LA, you have this kind of juxtapositions of machine and body. We're always trying to compete. We're always trying to find that happy medium, or the happy spirit. But I think you really have it in your work, and also in the streets of East LA, part of street vendors, you know, in every corner in LA are probably changing the landscape a lot more than an engineer can do it, because they're actually occupying spaces and kind of creating that sense of humanist to it, humanizing spaces.
Mhm.
So your work, the sculpture work really kind of captures that sense of body and how you kind of radiate space and shape from it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, James, I was reading something you had written over the weekend, and I love this line you had about like that LA doesn't have a center yet, like everyone's front yard becomes that center. And I was wondering, and maybe it's a question for all of us, and also Alberto, jump in if there are questions that people want to ask. But there was a sense that like immigrants have saved the city from its centerlessness, right? And I think right now there's again the sense that like immigrants and like people who want to support them and fight back are going to save the US from Trump. We're going to go out in the streets. We're going to be the ones who push back and fight back. I wonder what the tension is between like when are we going to stop saving like this fucking city, this fucking country, like like the parallel also runs with museums, right? Like artists of color are going to save the museums again from like by making on a very base level by making good art, right? Like um so this is not a question, this is more of a comment, not a question.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, it's just, yeah, it's like, you know, like you saw these murals, like I grew up in East LA back in, I was here for the 72 political unrest, and, you know, the whole city just transformed after that. Because, you know, where the civil rights movement started with African Americans, as Chicano interpreted as a way to create place. So all of a sudden we had this like modern world of utopia starting to crack with murals, you know, like in fact with the, you know, we had all these muralists put, you know, the freeway 101 a long time ago, they put murals up there, and you know, this whole idea of like the word plaza, you had a lot of architecture being built, kind of understanding what does this Chicano space look like, and how does it push back against modernism, utopia, car culture that had kind of built the city and still today. And I think it's the way to kind of humanize it. Say we are human beings. We're not going to be we're not going to be driverless. Being driverless cars, going to be human beings. And that's kind of the, you know, the Latino interventions in the body always remind us that we're human.
There's always sort of this reaction to return to the streets, right? And an act of subversion. You know, you're talking about the Chicana movement, and of course it's kind of hard to not think about ASCO and the way they really inhabited the street in moments of high tension and really transformed both themselves, but also the landscape through sometimes these processionals.
Yeah, because those are fundamental, real feelings that we have. If we're going to be hungry, we're going to fall in love, we're going to have these real feelings. That's what cities are all about. We're not trying to put them in boxes and put them away and put them in shelves and say, okay, let's go. Yeah, that's what we do as architects and planners. We kind of put them away in little nice little cubby holes.
So I'd like to jump in and maybe bring up another question that came up in the chat. This one by Caroline Liu. Referring back to what Nico had mentioned about image, Caroline says, I'd love to hear more about everyone's thoughts on the parentheses possibility, extractive nature of the photograph, and how that informs the tension between image and form in Jackie's practice. I think to maybe chime off a little bit onto that is, you know, Jackie, you work as a photographer and you create images. So how does image, or could you elaborate maybe on image that informs opinions about immigrants, or how this in general informs your practice overall? I guess this like emphasis on that idea of like an image.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're, it's a really great question because, you know, how do you depict labor or the laborer without, right, like we've talked about, like flattening their experience or also really objectifying it, right? I think I lean in my practice towards looking at how people form spaces, how they shape the environment to reveal, oh, this isn't, it's also about knowledge building, knowledge creation, building, craft. And I think that's why I tend to focus on what it is that people are making and working on instead of, imaging a face or a body or a color of skin or flesh. Because that kind of, that to me sometimes feels so reductive and but also actually more recently reflecting on how painful that is actually to be imaging ourselves and people and putting that out there. And in some ways, my practice has a kind of removal from that pain. I think I might be, looking at exteriors for that reason.
Moving on to another question
Sorry,
that
let
came.
me follow for like a sorry. My
That's
brain
okay.
works slow, works very slowly sometimes, but oh my God, like what you were just talking about, Nico, about really how our images of, I mean, very perfect example, what's happening today with these protests there, we have these images of people of color carrying, right, holding up flags that of course the right are going to take those images and see like, oh, here's this narrative of invasion, right? And it's just so, that's why the photograph is so dangerous and holds so much power, is that once your image is out there, you have no control over how someone will use your image. And it's,
Yeah, because the art is not automatically good or bad, right? And like it's not like only the good guys have art on their side, right? The ice has its own visual
Art.
language and aesthetic, and like they will,
Use it
yeah, they will
both
use
ways.
it. Yeah, they will use it, and stage it.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more. With sculpture, it's very difficult to do that because you have to experience it. And people are going to experience this work in a generally the same way. They're going to see it as movement of tile in the spaces, and they're not going to come out and say, "Oh, it was something different," because our bodies, our senses, react to situations or objects in very much the same way as human beings. You're gonna put a plate of food in somebody and they're gonna eat it. They're not gonna step on it, they're gonna eat it. Yeah, that's kind of how what we do with food, right? So I think so these objects really tell kind of a truer story of what's going on with the world and the image. Yeah, because images can be again used for different ways. But this is like, yeah, I feel that tile over my head. I feel that tile beside me, and everybody's gonna feel that same way.
yeah, it is a space, and sculptures really that call into question the precarity of your own safety, right? That's such an important part of the work, is that I don't feel comfortable standing under them sometimes, right? Though I know they're not gonna come down, but sorry. I mean, it's just because of, because of the weight of them, because of anything that's hovering above your head, you're always aware of,
Yeah, but that's just human nature.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone's not gonna go on there and take a bite of that tile. Keeping this food.
But have you seen those videos where they cut into them and sometimes it's cake? I mean, there's some things that, like, that's part of art too, though. It's like an illusion. Like it's not all what it appears to be. And then like there are a lot of kinds of art that people don't think are art. Like graffiti, talk about Osco and graffiti in East LA. Like not everyone agrees, even within the neighborhood, right, on what is valued, right? The distinction between what is a graffiti and what is a mural and what should be painted over and is harming the corner store and what is, a work of art that the museum should celebrate or whatever.
but-
It's not always so clear cut.
Yeah, but sometimes, like in the case of what's your neighborhood, there's so much of that being produced, it just becomes kind of a normal everyday activity. You know, it's like, you know, I can tell people, you know, you see some front yards that are beautiful, and then next year it's all remodeled and taken down. Yeah, just because it's always this constant production of things, of art, of spaces that we're always in this circle with. Where in the world of topiary, that, you know, like, you know, that's gonna they stay there for 50 years, the same shape. It's gonna be maintaining that same topiary shape.
Well, they can't change. They can't change that.
They can't change them now. It's just,
Really?
yeah, they keep that shape. You know, they don't grow a different way. They just
If it's like a camel shape, it's always going to be a
camel
camel.
shape. Yeah, not gonna become an elephant.
It could die.
Yeah, but not become an elephant or become a bird. But it's just this maintaining.
No, it's got to be able to. Okay, we're going to table. Alberto, are there any other questions before I fall too deep into the hole of the
Yes, absolutely. So this next one comes from Nadia Estrada. Nadia is expressing their thanks for the panel in general and their appreciation for your work, Jackie, and the way that your work sort of interacts with space and memory. And this sort of is a blanket kind of question for all the panelists. That I think can stimulate maybe expanding more on the question using particular examples, either within the work or maybe the instance of you seeing the work initially when those shingles were falling, and or even relating to what's happening today. But the question is to you and the panelists, why do you think Los Angeles, parentheses, or Southern California is an interesting case study when thinking about space and place?
Well, I think because everybody has access to it. You know, when you go to a place like New York City, the space is very premium there, and you might have an inch or 2 inches to do something, but generally, you know, the West has always been very accessible, and it's because of geography, the space we have, the climate, and the kind of characteristic of LA. You know, LA's DNA has always been reinvention. I mean, it's compared to Northern California, like San Francisco, where they had a bay, they had water, they had gold, they had redwood trees, they had everything they needed. But here we had nothing. We had no water, we had no harbors, we had to make it ourselves. So it's invention kind of embedded in our DNA. So we're always going to reinvent ourselves. It's just how we roll the city. So you see these ideas can come in and out and kind of manifest themselves. They're where people aren't going to really change Manhattan because it's the way it is, just concrete.
Yeah, I think that expansiveness is so unique to this region, right? But also that people want to be here. But yeah, having all that space, I mean, we see how it's actually been so deeply constructed since its beginning, right? Bringing in the non-native plants, creating the sense of paradise always through non-native plants. But also this is sort of a really important bedrock too for different kinds of innovative architecture, right? And create different ways of building and creating. Really thinking also about, you know, how you can really walk through a neighborhood and see sometimes, you know, I don't know, like 10 different types of architecture, and the constant renewal and the constant change that's happening, I think is so unique to this region. And our investment really in how light functions in this space. LA light, but also, and then like, you know, the modernist sort of, you know, explosion of affordable housing, and actually how beautiful it could be to have that relationship with our natural space and interiority.
I don't know. One of the reasons I moved to New York for school was I kept on being like, it can't be that LA is so special, right? This can't be true, right? like I thought like I've been brainwashed. Like I grew up here, and like when I was growing up and getting into the arts, like that's when PST happened, right? So like I guess it started feeling so boosterish, right? Like like how like what a special city, how special how special we are, right? Even with the acknowledgement of like you invented freeways, you know, what I mean, the front yards, East LA front yards, wonderful contribution to the world, but you know, does it balance out the sin of inventing the freeway? But then, but then it keeps on like I don't know, like Los Angeles keeps on in some ways like earning that. I don't know. Like every time I'm back visiting, something happens. It could be something terrible. Like I was here and the fires are happening in Altadena, and that was a scary time to be here. And you know, I'm here for 3 weeks right now, and like these fucking ice raids start happening, and the protests start happening, and like that's both inspiring and terrifying, right? So I don't know. I'm a little more agnostic or skeptical, right, of the specialness of the city, but keep being proved otherwise. There's a tension there,
Well, it's always evolving. It's always a moving target.
but so is everywhere.
Yeah, but
New York's always evolving. It's getting more and more
more
expensive, seems to
expensive,
be. I mean,
but
but
you
so
still
is
have-
Los Angeles.
yeah, but you still have like the subway, Times Square, you know,
Yeah.
these physical icons downtown, uptown. And that subway map is probably 100 years old. It
Yeah.
still works. People still use it. People still follow it.
Doesn't work, but yeah.
You know, you know
The Q works.
yeah.
Shout out to the Q.
Yeah.
So I'm going to sort of semi-combine two questions here in the chat that I think may be able to tie together. So Linda Areola comments that the space feels like you are walking into a frozen frame, motion is still, and then there is the question of the reconstruction of the tile, quote, Spanish tile into something new, perhaps Mexican. So their question is, can you talk more about the visitor and what you want them to experience, presumably when they come into the space? And then similar, or sort of chiming on to that, I want to add that Gustavo Rincon earlier had asked, I'm just finding it here, what references, media and or books can you refer them to that, you know, might be helpful in better understanding the work, or just generally architecturally or LA. And so I do want to just note that, Jackie, you do have a recommended book on site at ICLA for visitors when they do come in. So maybe answering that question and then connecting that visitor experience to also recommendations of books, since that is something that a visitor can have access to when they come to the museum.
Yeah, Magical Urbanism by
David.
yeah, Mike Davis is the recommended book that I found really explicit in explaining, you know, really the role of Latinos in placemaking in this region. James, I feel like I also see they asked you specifically of any LA architectural or urban planning like books that could help inform people's curiosity.
There's a lot of books written about LA, a lot. I'm just trying to figure out what would be a good one about DNA of the city. I guess it's such a broad topic, from housing, transportation. It's not like one size fits all, you know. But I think there's a couple of books on Latino urbanism. You know, I have a couple of essays out there that I can share with people that I've written about from this East Side perspective.
So the question about that, Linda.
Oh yeah, about the visitor experience.
Yeah, the visitor experience, but also the tile, you know, the reconstruction of the tile, the Spanish tile into something new, perhaps Mexican. And I mean, you know, this is actually one of my early investments in this object is how it really carries with it so much history. I mean, literally physically the tiles in that space have a patina, has a residue of 100 years in this region. But I'm hoping that visitors will start to think about, like, right, where did these come from, and how do objects sort of infiltrate and inform relations of power and history of migration at the same time, right? The more we learn about the Spanish tile, and these in particular, the revival, we're understanding that it was about a recreating a romanticized time of when the Spanish sort of started to colonize this region and take over sort of indigenous land and exploit people for their labor. But even before then, right, that tile came from Spain. Before that, the Moors.
Yeah.
Right. So really, we're also looking at a tracing of a material history, but also of a people.
Yeah.
And in terms of what I'm hoping, what I want them to take out of it, really, I care more about what they experience in the space, and what, hearing from them, hearing from you, what it feels like in there for you, right?
Yeah, I think as a trained urban planner, I had an art gallery in downtown LA a couple of years, started with artists. So it really opened my eyes to how artists see the world, and how the world is kind of based on our sensory experiences, and our memories. So that's how we should start. That should be the lens of planning, not just highest and best use and what's the most economic value to a place, but rather, like, I did my research in East LA, you realize that people are bringing all these memories into this landscape that are just, you don't see them, they're in their head, they're in their memory banks. They're not written down. People aren't going to go to Home Depot and buy a front air plaza. They're just going to build it from memory. That really shapes cities. And then you have this whole sensory experience of place that really our body had. We learned as children how to understand space through our senses. As adults, we can tap into it. For example, like, I do a lot of pedestrian advocacy, and you could put a stop sign, crosswalks on every stop on Wilshire Boulevard, Vermont.
Yeah.
Now it's safer, but does
Would
it
it-
feel safer? Still feels like it's dangerous to cross, right? Because of all these sensory details, like sound, noise, the roar, the mass of the cars. That sensory, if data says it's not safe, even though intellectually meant that, yeah, it is safe because the crosswalk is stop sign. So it's always balancing out, this technical world of, how we plan a city, but then how does our sensory world understand it? We can't intellectualize our cities to make it better places. We have to use our senses to do that. And everybody has its different, that's what a lot of work I do, is having people build with their hands and their senses to understand space, rather than just talk about it. You can intellectualize anything, but that can make a better place. That's why I think artists work like Jackie really kind of capture these senses that we really need to start to understand how we make better places, a different starting point.
Wonderful. Just a reminder to everyone who is on this Zoom, please definitely feel confident in keeping those questions coming. And I do want to point us to the Zoom chat as well, that both Gustavo and Vidal have shared quite a handful of links here to some potential books, or at least resources and related links. So please definitely give those a look as well. I want to turn our attention to a question. Let's see here. A question by Misty Choi, who contextualizes their question by stating that Los Angeles is vast, structured around cars rather than public transportation, and shaped by deepening social polarization. Despite the abundance of open space, it often doesn't feel like a blessing. Instead, that spatial vastness can evoke a sense of emptiness or depression. Given this distinctive spatial character of LA, a city that feels expansive yet fragmented, seemingly free yet emotionally isolating, I'd also like to ask, what does an ideal city look like to each of the panelists? And what do you think is necessary in order to create such a city? What kind of conversation do you think is needed among people for building said city?
My ideal city looks like a place where you can just walk to everything you need, which is kind of the opposite of LA. So, yeah, I mean, I know it's
Yeah. Well, I think for me, again, the ideal city would be a place that kind of fulfills your senses. You know, your happy senses, everything, it makes you feel comfortable, it makes you feel good to be in this place. 'Cause at the end of the day, that's how people are gonna understand a place, how it feels. If it feels like crap, I'm not gonna go back there. Feels good, I'm gonna go there. So just really starting with this whole different starting point of our senses and memory to build the city rather than just again intellectualize it. Because people will use transit if it feels good. And but that's gonna be sound, smell, what you see, just has to make you feel fulfilled.
But then I think also like what feels good and what people want are not always like it's not always like a smooth one-to-one. Like right, like Jackie saying like I want to live in a walkable city, yet she lives in Los Angeles. Or like New York Transit does not feel good in the way that you traditionally would think of like something feeling good. Like it smells and it's loud and it's like a panic-inducing mess, right? But it like but it functions sometimes. I mean more than some other places. But like it's not again, it's like that. It's like I don't know, so like I have no idea what I want from a city, but like sometimes it feels like I don't want the city to be idealized, right?
Yeah.
Parts of what you love are these things that are inconvenient, or the ways that the inconvenient, messy, nasty parts of a city, you know, like make the beautiful and convenient parts make sense.
Yeah.
Like LA has gorgeous sunsets,
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
They're just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I think as human beings, we have a lot more in common than we let on because for my practice, my art practice, and my planning practice, I have people build their favorite child memories, starting to put to understanding the city. And generally, you could have people from all over the world, different languages. They're going to build the same memory. As kids, they're going to want spaces that are nurturing, that are healthy, that are fun, that are curious, that are nature, that are outdoors. Because for a kid, your body understands the flower more than the book, more than the house, because that's how we're kind of their human body talking. People have a lot more, and I tell them, that moment that you build with these objects, that's your happy moment, that's your DNA for city planning. You're gonna look for that emotion wherever you go, New York, Boston, China, Latin America, Mexico. You're gonna look for that feeling. So we need to figure out what that feeling is. How do we get there? Yeah, and I say most people's memories are always outdoors in nature. Hearing birds, with family and friends, walking around, running around. And this physical connection, relationship to spaces that people are drawn to. But as adults, we get kind of carried away with our cars and our jobs and our this and our that and our big houses that we kind of move away from that. At the core of us, that's what we all want.
That's a great point. Like you can put up with a lot if you feel safe, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways you can think about like what does it mean to fight against ICE, right? Is to create the kind of city where it doesn't matter that the bus never arrives on time, or that like the smog is fucking terrible, because you're safe, right? And you need to like have a base level of safety to be able to live and enjoy in the city. You can't do it if you're living in fear that way. And so like that's a way of building a city that you want to be in. James, that's a great point. Like as I said, an ideal city is a safe one. The rest of it can come second, right?
Yeah. I think for decades, like my family, we've been there for decades. You know, it's always been a safe place. People coming in and out from Mexico to here. You know, it's always been this kind of place where it's always been safe that way.
Mhm.
And that's kind of been why we're so prosperous and strong, because we've been able to maneuver all these different situations and prosper. Right now, people are saying you can't do that. You have to be one or the other, you have to draw these lines. Where you know, growing up, we had great Spanish aunts that just spoke Spanish and probably at the party, but you know, they were just there. You know, so were they legal document or not, we don't know, but they were just there. They were part of the infrastructure of our family. And that was the safe space.
Yeah. I mean, and also building on top of family, right, is community. Like, how do you even develop those relationships with each other? I think you can do it through different ways of designing space and city planning, right? How do you create more areas of rest, gathering, and belonging together is sort of the key. Is like, how do you do that together? But then also, like, you know, creating space in a way that actually slows you down, that causes pause, maybe makes you meander. I don't see that very often. And I think that's another reason why I pivot so much to photography, and that experience of walking with the camera is that the camera actually slows me down an incredible amount to actually see what's in front of me, right? It's the tool that allows me to do that, to make these images that I find, you know, I find these other, again, these both moments of alienation, but also beauty, but also people, what people do, what are these unconscious gestures they're always doing and making in the landscape.
Yeah, I think that's one of the highlights of Latino neighborhoods. Because, you know, when I was documenting them, it always had to be walking. The street vendor, the front yard. You know, when you walk, you see all these details. When you drive through, it looks like a mess. Well, it's messy. It's not a freeway, it's messy. But when you're walking there, you have these sensory overloads of that. You see a shrine, you see a flower, you see a cactus, you see all these things start to fold in front of you when you walk. So it makes it a very rich sensory experience. You know, but yet since people don't walk, they drive, they miss half of it. So I think that's why that's why you know, but having to articulate what these senses are, what these needs are, it's a better place to live. It can't fulfill you in these sensory ways that the car can.
Wonderful. I think those were excellent perspectives on that question. I am just going to time check us, and maybe we'll lead towards wrapping up with this final question. And maybe it'll allow us to expand a little bit more on these ideas of those invisible histories embedded in the work and generally. Jackie, and Nico and James. So Irma in the chat asks, have you considered using older handmade tiles, many of which have the fingerprints of the people who produced them? And they also add that maybe it's an interesting layer to your work and your narrative about it. So I think again, bringing up this theme of those invisible and embedded histories into these materials, and how you can maybe expand further on that.
Well, I haven't considered using that particular material because I haven't run into it physically and seen it. I mean, you know, this way of making is so sometimes really convoluted, because what I'm really doing is reacting so often to what is being discarded. And you really have to sort of be at the right place at the right time if those materials are going to find you, or you're going to find those materials. I mean, it makes me think about, like, James, when old, really historic structures are being taken apart, or, you know, these materials that really do carry with them so much history, how are those treated in preservation, or when things are getting obviously developed? There's absolutely no care for them, right?
Yeah, I think materials, it's a really important part of our culture, and it's interesting because, you know, with the fires in Altadena, were looking at the fireplaces and getting the Beltray tiles, because those are, you know, artistically made tiles. And also it's kind of knowing what people produce. Usually in the course of labor just produces something, and it's a transaction, but knowing that you produce is going to be a refrigerator, a stove, garment, it has different meaning to it. And that's why I think it's interesting looking at LA and labor. And one time, I can remember back in the 20s and 30s, it was a big manufacturing town. So we're making stoves, we're making all these things, and that's kind of in our DNA. But all these things that we produced, they just disappear, or they just get discarded. We're not really memorizing. You know, we don't really memorialize the labor that way. And there's an old tile company in Montebello called Simmons Tiles, a brick company. They produce a lot of brick, called Simmons. It's Simmons Brick, and you still see them around in places in LA. Simmons Brick means that it came from Montebello, and probably was made by Latinos back in the 1920s. So these artifacts that do linger around.
Jackie, can you make a material special?
Can you make a material special?
Yeah, like as an artist, like, is that, like, I wonder, like, okay, like you haven't used a tile with a fingerprint on it, right? But you pay close attention to your materials. Is there, maybe this is cheesy, but is there some special artist sense that you have when you're looking at these things? Yeah. And like, I don't know, do materials call out to you? Are you walking around the streets and like?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, recently what I've been, you know, the last few months, what I've really been doing is looking for, actually going to these sites of demolition. And really the first time in my practice where, I mean, there's the problem of the material and the collecting is, you know, I'm taking sections of actual mortar embedded with tile, these, you know, that have, you know, breaks and chips of everyday life in them, that people are, you know, they're tearing out of these, you know, again, almost 100-year-old structures that carry with them, you know, a lot of the memories that people who have inhabited these with it. And what is the sense? Why do I take these things? You know, I think it's a combination of it kind of calling out with some kind of nostalgia, but also just a knowledge that I know these are not made in this way anymore. So I think it's also an inclination to try to preserve a history of making, or something that has, like, you know, a craft that is no longer like those tiles you talked about. I don't think they can make those tiles anymore, right? So I think it's also trying to salvage these things with some history in them.
To me, that's like a very photographic impulse then. You know, you're trying to hold on to something, like things are slipping away. But part of what art does is to then add, like, to make it special, even though like maybe it didn't have it before. Like for you, maybe you see that there was something special, but I would walk by all sorts of parts of the city and be like, there's a bunch of junk right there. Like while they tore down that, there's an empty lot near my parents' house. Well, that lot's been torn down. Like,
right.
It doesn't, there's not the impulse to then bring it out and call attention to it.
Yeah, I think sometimes I actually don't, in the moment, it's really hard to sort of pinpoint, but same with the photograph. Sometimes I don't know why I'm making an image on that site. It takes it sort of subsumed and into like darkness. That film sort of allows it to like inhabit almost into the unconscious, or taking these materials and, storing them in my dad's garage until months later I'll be like, this is what I'm supposed to do with these. Right, this is how the stills of the videos function here too. This is a video shot in 2017 that it took years for me to come back to that moment to understand, like, oh yeah, right, there's something so important happening here. And this is just I was given the space to see it through and actually create it. And that's sort of maybe where the last sort of thing I will sort of end at is how grateful I am that I was able to make this work, but also so proud that I was able to bring in my father, bring in someone who's a working class person who doesn't necessarily consider themselves an artist, but I do, right? I sort of see the way people problem solve and create, and the potential of what working class people can do if they're given the space and time. It's really it was a really important part of this work. Yeah, thanks.
That's a great place to end, I think. Alberto, do you have any wrappings up beyond our thanks to everyone who showed up and on the Zoom? Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Shout out to my sister Naima and all of her roommates, Francisco, Corneli, Mayra, for letting us use the space.
Oh yeah, we're all here together, even though we're on
Zoom,
but we're all here. Thank you.
Yes, so definitely very much thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Very, very grateful for those in the chat who shared those incredible books and resources and links, and for your incredible questions. We couldn't get to every single one, but we did get through quite a handful of very weighted ones, and I think that's really great. This is just a reminder that ICALA is open, and we are available for you to come and see the show in person. Please do so safely. And if you didn't get your question answered, then definitely coming to the space and initiating some conversation would be wonderful. Thank you very much to all of our panelists tonight. Really, really grateful for your time. And yes, just as a reminder, the show Jackie Castillo, Through the Descent Like the Return, is up and on view at ICALA through August 31st. Thank you everyone for your time tonight, and stay safe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
29.